The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. Joining me tonight is my lovely partner and extremely intelligent cohort, Leah Shaper. And without her, I just ramble on about nothing because I have no one to challenge me on my points of view. So welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Your audio's a little low.
Is it?
Yeah, is there a way you could turn that up?
Well, let's see. I will work on that.
All right, you actually sound a little better now. Okay, let's just jump right into it. I'm going to share a screen. You're in Radio Land. You can't see anything. Hopefully, you'll be able to pick this up as soon as I drop it. Now, I talked last episode about some flash frozen mammoths. And the fact that these mammoths are not all being frozen at the Younger Dryas boundary, in fact, many of them date back to the Lachamp magnetic excursion, it starts to raise some eyebrows about a few things. What I concluded in the last show was that the idea of a catastrophic pole shift or crustal slip occurring on regular intervals at, like, say, 12,500 years doesn't seem to hold weight if you believe the peer-reviewed literature that they're finding things flash frozen that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years, dating back 45,000 years, some of them, then what that means is that the Arctic Circle has been frozen and has been the Arctic for that entire period of time. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would agree with that assessment for the most part.
Now, there are some questions that you can bring up. You can bring up that dating techniques might be flawed, that solar outbursts may change the dates. But the point is that there is a large number of these flash frozen objects being found around 41,000 years ago, which is the Lachamp excursion. And something very bizarre happened on Earth. It was the lowest field intensity of our magnetic field for a very long time. Over almost 1 million years, I would say. I would have probably at least over 100,000 because the Pringle Falls is pretty equivalent. But the Lachamp is unique in that it was a mass extinction. It ended many megalithic fauna. It also megafauna. We're not talking about megaliths.
Well, so megalithic fauna, megafauna goes with megalithic structures. So there you go.
Yeah. But so there was a die-off of certain megafauna, including different species of mammoths and bison, and during this time. But the most interesting thing is that the Neanderthals went extinct and that Homo sapiens took over. So this is a unique event. And at the same time, we're getting these flash frozen animals in the Arctic. Now, they're frozen in deposits called the black muck or the gray muck. These are catastrophic deposits where the material inside is broken up, shattered, and then like smashed and in place as if it were some type of mud flood or in all the peer-reviewed literature, post-impact deposits. So you have an impact on the ice because remember, during this time, 45,000 to the Younger Dryas, the ice cap is up there the whole time. So what's suggested is that impactors hitting the ice sheet cause catastrophic floods up in the Arctic, which then preserve, and then they get frozen because it's the Arctic. They
Right.
preserve these deposits in perpetuity.
Very interesting. What's Pringle Fall? Is that what you said earlier?
Yeah, Pringle Falls is earlier than the Lachamp. It's a magnetic excursion that goes back about 150,000 years.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about the mummified baby woolly mammoths. Like I said, they're all different dates here. And here's a few quick facts. A quick examination of some of the woolly mammoths, or the small one that we're talking about specifically, was that it was female and it's roughly the same size as a 42,000-year-old infant woolly mammoth named Lubya, which was discovered in Siberia. This one is a more recent discovery. So geologists from the Yukon Geologic Survey and the University of Calgary who recovered the mammoth made an easy assumption on the stratigraphy that it was frozen in the permafrost during the Ice Age, and it must be over 30,000 years old based on its position. So that's another old one that is not related to the Younger Dryas, because clearly they know where that is. It's way above in the stratigraphic column where,
Right.
where they can find the black mats. So this is it's well below the Younger Dryas event. Any comments?
Well, just once again confirming that catastrophes on Earth are a somewhat regular phenomenon.
Right, and they're probably not pole shift or crustal slip, because
Right.
the Arctic has been in the Arctic for tens of thousands of years. And according to Hapgood and the Adam and Eve story, this is a recent event, and it happens every 12,500 years, and there's no geologic evidence to support this. Well, actually, you could cherry pick some geologic evidence, but the overwhelming geologic evidence is against the crustal slip and the pole flip.
Right.
Anyway, at the time scales we're talking, so we must also get that concept out there. So we're talking at least for 50,000 years, and this is why I'm going to blow your mind, Leah, and the people listening today, because a new paper just came out, and it's going to blow your mind because it's going to make us push that 50,000 year date all the way back to 2 million years, which is right at the beginning of the Ice Age. So prior to 2.5 million years ago, there was no Arctic ice. That's how warm it was.
Yeah.
And some reason around 2.5 million, we started this Ice Age, and there's been ice up in the Arctic almost continuously up until now. A new paper coming out has isolated DNA from the frozen permafrost, and the oldest DNA ever found intact was around 1 million years old from the same area. Well, this DNA is 2 million years old, flash frozen in the permafrost, has never thawed or it would have degraded. And so now we can push the date of the Arctic being in the Arctic back 2 million years. So there hasn't been any crustal slip or catastrophic pole flip for 2 million years. And I'll get to that paper in a minute. I jumped the gun. I got a little excited. But what I'm showing you here now is the circumarctic map of permafrost. And if you see the purple, or I don't know what color you would say they are, like the deep maroon and lavender areas, those areas are permafrost that have been frozen for up to 2 million years, we now know. That is mind-blowing. And they form the perfect circle around the Arctic, which means they have been frozen for 2 million years. Now, anything coming to you on that?
No, just that it's a really long ass time.
Yeah. So, and when they did, so not only did they find the DNA from these sediments, they also found microfossils and pollen spores and other markers that allowed them to reconstruct a paleogeography from 2 million years ago in the Arctic. And this is at the beginning of the Ice Age. So it's the warmest of the coldest temperatures, so to speak. And in fact, in this permafrost, it was a lush tropical forest. And the illustration you can see there is a depiction of what they found. They found hares. You see the rabbit in the front. They found different types of mammoths. And obviously all kinds of flowers and plants that were growing up here in an area that is now that has been frozen forever since then. That's pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy.
Yeah. So let's talk about it. The breakthrough of this 2 million year old DNA and guess where it's from? Greenland, northern Greenland. So Greenland is now covered with miles of ice, and the mainstream media claims it's melting so fast we're all going to die. But it was much, much warmer in Greenland just 2 million years ago. And the geology doesn't lie. And this breakthrough pushes back DNA, like I said, records by 1 million years. It doubles it. This is a very important recent discovery.
Yeah.
Now, 2 million year old DNA from northern Greenland has revealed that the region was once home to mastodons, lemmings, geese, and offering unprecedented insights into how climate change can shape ecosystems. Now, do you notice how they throw that word in there as if the normal brainwashed person is going to be like, oh yeah, man had something to do with it.
Right.
This is warmer back then.
Right.
It's just misinformation for the masses. Now, the breakthrough in ancient DNA pushes back the DNA record by 1 million years. And this is to a time when the Arctic region was 11 to 19 degrees C warmer than present day.
Very significant.
Yeah, because the environment is flourishing. The biodiversity is amazing. And they want you to think that if the temperature goes up 1 degree or 2 degrees C, we're all going to die. And yesterday there were headlines that said that cities are going to reach the highest temperature ever. It's going to be unlivable and the entire populations will die. This is so ludicrous.
You know, the other thing about the sentence that you pointed out, the phrase, how climate change can shape ecosystems. The other thing about that that's really silly is it suggests that, you know, climate and ecosystems are somehow separable, right? That climate change is the agent of everything in ecosystems. These things are completely intermingled and they affect each other. It's a really silly way of framing it.
Yeah, because as the climate changes, the ecosystems typically move with it.
Right, they adjust.
But they actually move with it laterally. So if the temperature is rising in a continent, the forests start moving to the north. They change, the species start migrating to where they're comfortable. So the climate is creating the ecosystem in a sense. They're directly linked.
But the phrase it's meant to place blame, right? It's meant to say that there's an agent of change, aka man. You know, that's the implication. But there's a lack of recognition. It's like a uniformitarianism issue, right? That everything's the same and that species should never die and ecosystems should never ever change. And if they do, something really bad is happening. It's completely erroneous.
Yeah, because due to this study, Greenland was 11 to 19 C warmer. That's like 25 Fahrenheit or more. It means that as the climate changes, even if it changes in a dramatic way, 20 degrees C, that the ecosystem can shift and everything can flourish. And in this case,
it's an indication of health too, right? The ability to adjust to changing conditions that our Earth can do, that's health.
Yeah, and you can think about it this way. The desert southwest of the U.S. is a hellhole. You can barely grow food there. It barely rains. But at some point in the future, the climate will shift. It'll start raining there, and the ecosystem will flourish. And somewhere else, a desert will form. I mean, this is just how it's been happening forever.
And while it's a desert here, there's some other area on Earth that is wet and lush and flourishing with life.
Yeah, and almost always that's at or near the equator, where some of those deserts are. There's also rainforests. Mm-hmm. Now, okay, we just covered that the fact that this study determined the northern portion of Greenland was 11 to 19 C warmer than present day. The analysis also reveals that the northern peninsula of Greenland, which is now a polar desert, once featured boreal forests of poplar and birch, teeming with wildlife. That's amazing. And here it says, this work offers clues to how species might adapt or be genetically engineered to survive the threat of rapid global heating. Now, were people back here 2 million years ago genetically engineering the ecosystem so that it would make it?
Right, right. I mean, and they say might adapt. Notice, like, not that they won't, but they might. We're not sure. We're worried about those species because we might have to genetically engineer them because they might not adapt.
We're putting so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, species can't keep up. Yeah. And this paper, obviously, it's written by a liberal rag. It's The Guardian. So.
Oh, well, there you go.
All right. So the fragments are 1 million years older than the previous record for DNA. And this DNA was found up in these frozen mucks just like this was, but a million years earlier, and that was from a Siberian mammoth bone. And I think they even tried to extract some DNA and maybe using that to reanimate the mammoth. I think you and I have talked about that. They're going to CRISPR splice some mammoth sections of DNA that they have. They don't have a whole mammoth genome. They have a few fragments. And so what they think is if they chuck a few fragments of mammoth into an elephant, that you'll get an mammoth.
This sounds like a terrible idea. Like really terrible.
It's already happening and we don't know about it.
Didn't they watch Jurassic Park?
Yeah, it's illegal. But the billionaire that is doing this work wants to, in fact, open a Pleistocene island, just like Jurassic Park.
Oh, that'll go wonderfully, I'm sure.
Yeah, he's not going to have dinosaurs there, just giant 9-foot sloths that can eat you.
Right.
And maybe a short-faced cave bear.
But, you know, I will say it would be very interesting to see if someone were to succeed at doing that, it would be interesting to see how those animals would cope with the conditions on Earth right now. And I'm guessing they wouldn't cope very well. There's a reason why those animals went extinct.
Yeah, there are, but there's enough, I think, paleogeographic information that, you know, you would have to pick a group of animals that all lived in the same environment or you would really get screwed.
Yeah,
so,
well, that's
yeah.
true.
You couldn't just pick a bunch of things you found and throw them all together and feed them and say, hey, it'll probably work.
I'm sure somebody will try, though.
But then you have the problem with humans overhunting them and making them go extinct. Okay, so now let's get into this study. This study has been going on for a long time. It wasn't just like some guy went out last year and took some sand and was like, hey, I found 2 million-year-old DNA. Mm-hmm. So the colleagues worked on this project for the last 16 years. And what they were doing was looking through these sediments that were collected decades ago. And they found 41 samples of DNA hidden in the clay and quartz that were collected at previous studies. So that's kind of interesting. These are geeks that aren't field geologists that are saying, hey, what is this dirt? Oh, let me look at it. And so they're looking for genes in their genetics labs for decades. And then they found all these little pieces, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So the 41 samples were found hidden in clay and quartz, and they were being sequenced and identified for that 16 years. The ancient DNA samples were found buried deep in the Cap Copenhagen Formation, which is a sediment deposit that's about 100 meters thick and had built up over 20,000 years. That's interesting because most sedimentary rocks that represent 20,000 years in the rock record are only about a meter.
Huh.
Yeah. But this is, remember, this isn't rock yet. This is pretty recent sediment that's frozen into permafrost. So there's no rocks being formed. These are some of the oldest sediments that are not rocks yet.
So the development of the permafrost is preventing them from becoming rocks?
And there's nothing else piling up on top. You need billions of tons of more stuff on top to compress and lithify into a rock.
Right.
Yeah. So
what about miles of ice, though? Is that enough to do it?
Clearly not. It's just going to freeze the sediment.
Yeah.
Yeah, because clearly these areas were covered in an ice sheet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so prior to it being covered in the ice sheet, go ahead.
Forming the rock is going to be a geochemical process, right? And so lacking heat, that's going to be very much slowed down.
Yeah, you need the right minerals, you need the right pressures, you need the right conditions. And if you don't have enough isostatic flexure, meaning typically where we get rocks that are being preserved are in basins that are filling up with so much weight of sediment that it's actually pushing the basin down into the crust, into the earth. And it's the amount of downward push that preserves that amount of rock. So every 100 meters down will push 100 meters of lithified rock into the rock record. It's just a simple way of thinking about it, but it's not actually a clear picture because there are proximal and distal places in a basin, meaning the edge or the middle, and the middle of a basin or a lake is going to have more or thicker sediment than the edge, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, so I'm just trying to simplify it for you here, but 100 meters thick, if we were actually to compress it, could be as thin as 20 meters or less of rock.
Well, and the cool thing about this is just because of this particular situation where this sediment hasn't been formed into rock because the conditions aren't right, it offers an amazing opportunity, right? Because now you have all this sediment you can dig through fairly easily compared to, like, would you be able to find DNA samples in rock? Well,
no, and that's the point. That's the point. Once it lithifies and the geochemistry happens, the DNA is gone.
Yeah.
Like there's no DNA from dinosaur fossils, even the best ones. They've tried,
right,
but they can't do it.
However, they did say they found DNA in quartz here.
In who?
Quartz.
The DNA was found hidden in clay and quartz, hidden in between the pebbles.
Oh, in between. I see.
Yeah.
I was when I read that initially, I was thinking it was inside the quartz, and I thought,
oh no, that would be the biggest breakthrough ever.
Right.
I mean, that DNA could be billions of years old at that point. So here's the paleogeographic picture. Around 2 million years ago, northern Greenland was not under ice. And this DNA was being deposited in these sand deposits, whatever was going on. And then shortly thereafter, because it says the deposit was occurring for about 20,000 years, shortly thereafter, it then got inundated with ice and remained under there for the entirety of the Ice Age until recently, the Younger Dryas event in the Holocene, the ice receded, Greenland began melting, and now this unit is exposed for the first time since it was buried in ice, and they're able to find DNA right between the grains in the sand. Just like if we went outside here, the ranch, and I took some dirt from the road and we sent it to a lab, they would find DNA of our chickens, of the deer that walk by, and of you and I and the dogs.
Sure.
Yeah. But this is amazing because the oldest DNA prior to this that they've ever found is 1 million years younger. So this is some old DNA.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. So we got 6 more minutes on this topic, and I want to get to some more interesting topics after the break. So let's try to sum this up. The oldest DNA is now shedding light on a 2 million year old ecosystem that has no modern parallel. Well, yeah, because all of these animals, for the most part, are extinct at this point. We're out of the major ice age. And in the last 2 million years, we've come through some major cosmic catastrophes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we don't just have the Younger Dryas extinction event because we're going back 2 million years. There are many, many other events. We've got the last geomagnetic pole flip on Earth is in there. That was at 770,000 years ago. So just under 1 million years ago, we had the geomagnetic pole flip. That event would have been catastrophic and killed off some of the fauna that may have lived on this island.
Sure.
And then we've got the Ice Age, which covers the island in a mile of ice. Clearly, there's nothing living there for like the last 1 million years or more. And now Greenland is being re-exposed. And here's an interesting thing I want to, follow up on here. As we get to modern times on Greenland, there was a culture that lived and flourished on Greenland, and it was the Vikings.
Mm-hmm.
And there's good reason that they were able to do that. It was because there was less ice on Greenland very recently. And a lot of people lose sight of that.
Yeah, and isn't it the case that there's evidence of the Vikings arriving to Greenland and then leaving again, which sort of corresponds to when there would be a bit more ice again? I sort of remember we looked at this a couple of years ago.
Yeah, the last Viking grave you can date is like at the beginning of maybe the Maunder minimum, 1400. Don't quote me on it. But when it gets really cold and the glaciers start advancing is when the last grave can be found in Greenland from the Vikings. And here's interesting, in this picture we're looking at, which on radio land you guys can't see, is a tree.
Yeah.
And wood just doesn't sit around like this without decaying and falling apart. So clearly there were trees recently right here on Greenland where you can see there is not even a blade of grass.
Yeah.
It's not like some guy brought that piece of wood there.
Right.
Yeah, so the Earth has recently been much warmer. than these alarmists are claiming that, and these alarmists are claiming that if we rise 1 or 2 degrees C by the end of the century, the whole world is going to perish, and that the ecosystems are going to fail. I mean, it was 20 degrees warmer here in Greenland, and everybody looked just fine.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. When we come back, we're going to talk about an asteroid that they just found in a blind spot between Earth and Venus. And it's not the only one. There are several, and these may hold the key to some of these questions we're asking.
Listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the 4 most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. #1 is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. #2 is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. #3, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. #4 is Advanced Ancient Global Civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe. We started off the show talking about some of the myths about the flash frozen mammoths, and we started to speculate that catastrophic pole shift or crustal slip is probably not a thing, because we've now pushed perfectly preserved DNA hidden in the permafrost to 2 million years ago, which means for 2 million years, the Arctic has been in the Arctic. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I really don't. I mean, I just don't see how you can come to any other conclusion in that regard, that the Arctic has been in the Arctic, like you said.
Now, can you see the screen with the asteroid?
Yep.
All right, so an extinction level asteroid that could someday hit Earth was recently found hiding near Venus. And I think we've talked on the show about the fact that a lot of asteroids that impact Earth, we've only ever been able to see 6 of them. The last one was just a few weeks ago up in Canada. We've only been able to see 6 asteroids before they hit Earth, and when we see them, it's just a few minutes before impact. So that should be very telling for if you're listening out there. They have a catalog of near-Earth objects, but none of them are on trajectory to hit us. The ones that are on trajectory to hit us, they can't see until they're about to hit us, and that is bad news.
It's hilarious because a couple of weeks ago we were talking about a hypothesis, an impact hypothesis, and scientists negating that hypothesis on the basis of, well, we've done the calculations of how many objects would hit Earth, and this indicates a much higher frequency than we would expect. And it's like, well, maybe your calculation is wrong. Maybe you're not seeing some of these objects. That's the other conclusion you can reach.
Yeah, and in fact, they're not. There is a whole bunch of objects between Earth and Venus that are hard to see because of the rotations of the planets. You're always kind of looking at the sun, which is why the morning star Venus is always just above or below the horizon most of the time. Mm-hmm. Very few times is Venus racing across the sky at night. You can only see it at sunrise and sunset, and that means that when you're looking towards these objects, you're looking at the sun, and it's hard to see tiny rocks like this. Well, anyway, rocks that if they hit Earth would ring Earth like a bell.
And they don't have to be that big either.
No. And so these are in what is called the blind spot. And the article says those that have driven a car are surely familiar with the idea of blind spots. So as telescope technology continues to advance, astronomers have used their scopes to peer into the blind spots in our solar system that were once difficult to observe. And recent telescopic observations at Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory in Chile, as the scientists there published in September of this year in the Astronomical Journal, that there are 3 near-Earth asteroids, so they added that to the catalog, that are hiding in the sun's glare, and which apparently had not previously been noticed. These particular asteroids are lurking between the orbits of Earth and its closest neighbor in the direction of the sun, Venus. And one of them is the largest potentially hazardous object ever spotted in 8 years.
Yay.
Yeah, the finding is particularly alarming because they suggest that there are many uncatalogued, potentially dangerous asteroids that humanity has missed in its quest to catalog and identify possible civilization-destroying asteroids or comets.
What do you know?
Yeah, and they go on. In particular, the newly discovered asteroid dubbed 2022 AP7 orbits the sun in such a manner that it will someday intersect and strike Earth.
You said will, the article says might.
It will. Come on. You can't just orbit in between 2 planets in close proximity forever and not hit something. That's just probably not an option. Or the entire solar system would be filled with asteroids.
Right. It's just a question of when.
When they hit. Now, and so we have all these objects nearby. So if there is a major solar outburst or something happens, does this track them into us?
Right.
Yeah, that's the question we need to be asking, because so far our only idea is that previous comets that broke up because of our sun or because of coming into the inner solar system that are now what we call meteor storms are the cause of cosmic catastrophe. But it very well may be that at certain times in the great year, these rogue objects come into Earth.
You could potentially argue that a smaller rogue object like an asteroid like this would be more affected by any electromagnetic changes that are happening in our solar system. So maybe that's the cause.
And because they're so nearby and they're within the orbit between the sun and the Earth, that if the sun outbursts, they would push them towards our orbit.
Right. Or at the very least, shift the existing orbit of such an object in such a way as to maybe fall into Earth.
And it's funny, the article mentions in 2005 that the U.S. Congress tasked NASA, never a straight answer, to find 90% of all near-Earth objects. Like, if they're finding an object that's going to hit us, do you think they're going to tell us?
Right.
It's so ludicrous.
And also, what are they going to do about it? You're going to find all of the 90% of the objects, and then what?
To monitor them, so if you can then calculate all the orbits out and say, oh, this might hit us in 2069.
Yeah, and what are you going to do about it?
Well, we have the ability to go out and shift asteroids. We just proved that in the DART mission just a few months ago.
Right.
So we can move these babies if we have enough time, and we only got to smash something the size of a van into the side of them to do it.
Right.
So that's good news. But the bad news is that the objects that hit Earth, we only see minutes before they hit. There's no way we're sending up a van to deflect it. And if you were to send a nuke up, all you would do is splinter it and have more impacts.
Right.
Like a Hollywood movie.
I was laughing too, because even if we had more time than a few minutes before seeing it, I was laughing in my head about how much bureaucracy there would be about deciding how to go about destroying or blowing up such an asteroid that it probably would never get done.
Well, yeah, and Bruce Willis is now disabled. He wouldn't even be able to get up there. Because he's the expert. Now it's weird in that terrible commercial that we hear at the break about Hitler. I wonder if that guy's friends with Yi.
Right, I was thinking the same thing when that commercial was playing.
All right, let's end up the show with a new paper from Valentina Zharkova that's coming out. We're going to be interviewing her on the channel. Leah, you're welcome to join us if you want. There's no date set, but she's busy this week, so it might be in a few weeks.
Okay.
But Tom Nelson recently had her on, and they were talking about the solar cycle prediction moving forward and how she did the work with machine learning, and kind of it covered the type of science she uses. She's a computer scientist.
Yeah.
And she is breaking open the doors of plasma physics in ways that plasma physicists haven't. And I shared with people that the predictions for solar cycle 24 were made before solar cycle 24 began. And then in the middle of solar cycle 24, it was apparent that 99.5% of astronomers and plasma physicists were wrong about the cycle, and Valentina Zharkova was right. Mm-hmm. And so she then predicted solar cycle 25 as being weak. Weak is 24 or thereabouts. And the mainstream, all of them said 25 is going to be the strongest cycle ever. And boom, once again, the mainstream scientists are wrong, and Valentina Zharkova was right. And what she's predicting is that solar cycle 26 is the null set, which would be the bottom of grand minima. And that's going to start in 5 or 6 years and last for over a decade, which means it will be the worst time on Earth as far as solar activity at its weakest. And the Earth will be the most vulnerable for solar flares.
Yeah.
And so, okay, you wanted to comment?
No, and volcanoes as well is what.
Yeah, so let's connect it to this paper. The reason she wrote this paper is when you run the machine learning through volcanic eruptions, and you also have the solar activity in there with the numbers, things start to line up. And they line up with a very high correlation. Now, her work is machine learning, and correlation is not causation. But in this case, I think it is. I mean, we can just go back to the work of, gosh, I'm forgetting his name, the author of Dark Winter.
Oh, I can't pull it up right now.
All right. Well, in that book, he predicted that during grand minimas, there are increased volcanic eruptions, and there are increased earthquakes. Now, this doesn't cover earthquakes, but it does cover volcanic eruptions. And if you're watching this on the video format, all the links to everything we talk about will be below the video. We implore you to go check out the sources. And also, if you're listening on the radio show for the first time, check out our YouTube channels, Oppenheimer Ranch Project and Magnetic Reversal News, as well as our newest channel, Sacred Geography. You'll find some really excellent content. So what I'm going to share with you here is the main data set that was used in picture form. So they took the sunspot data, which is the top graph, going back to the beginning of sunspots, which is right around the end of the Maunder minimum. So from 1750 to present, they input all of that sunspot data. And then below that, you can see all the VEI 4, 5, 6, and 7 eruptions that have occurred on Earth. And so I want to draw your attention to the first fact that there have not been any VEI 7 eruptions since the Tambora event back there in the year without a summer. And that happened directly at the minimum of the grand solar minimum known as the Dalton minimum. So at the bottom, the center of the bottom of the Dalton, VEI 7. There hasn't been a grand minimum that deep since then, but there was the centennial minimum, which went from about 1890 to 1910, which is these 3 cycles. And you can see there are 1, 2, 3 VEI 6s happening during that grand minimum, all 2 of them directly at the solar minimum. Mm-hmm. And so what her study is revealing is that the higher the volcanic explosive index, the more correlation with the solar minimum. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's bad news for us because that's coming up in just 5 years, or the decade after that would be the bottom of this grand minimum.
Well, and the additional variable that she points out in here is that when the magnetic polarity of the sun is southern, that's when we really start seeing a lot of these volcanic eruptions, and that's about to happen.
Yeah, that happens in about, the solar polar field reversal is in about 3 years. The solar polar field reverses at the time we call solar max. So yeah. So when we come into solar max in the next 2 years, the solar polar fields flip. Now, what we do know from suspicious observers work, Ben Davidson pointed this out, I think he might have wrote a paper on it 5 years ago, that during solar polar reversals, at that flexure point is when we have 8 plus 9 towards 9 magnitude earthquakes. Yeah. So the solar polar reversal is a big quake. A few years later, a big eruption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and in general, too, she also makes the important point that a lot of this will happen when there's what she calls a geomagnetic jerk, right? So there's a significant geomagnetic change that happens all of a sudden.
Yeah, and we can illustrate that from her paper if I could pull up this map. So
yes,
any of you can pull up reconstructions of the location of the northern magnetic pole from 1500 to 2020, and you're going to see it has 3 distinct movement planes. There's an earlier movement when it's far off from the rotational pole where it's going left or right, and then a geomagnetic jerk occurred, and then the pole started moving in a different direction. And this time it was moving directly away from the north rotational pole. And then we had the Carrington event, and the next year in 1860, another geomagnetic jerk, which has sent the pole in its current trajectory.
So interesting.
And this trajectory is a very scary one because previous trajectories, the green one, the initial one, which is a long time ago, prior, let's say Maunder minimum time, the pole was barely moving. It was just going back and forth, almost no movement annually. And then the geomagnetic jerk occurred. And then the movement increased a little bit where it was moving tens of miles a year. And then the Carrington event, and then the next geomagnetic jerk, and then it began accelerating even faster. And there hasn't been a geomagnetic jerk since then to change the trajectory. And we are now accelerating. Look at the annual movement in the last 5 years. It's crazy.
It's really crazy.
Now, a lot of people don't understand that this geopole, the geomagnetic pole, has nothing to do with when the sun rises and sets and the moon rises and sets. It's independent of that. And I don't think that a lot of people understand that. You have a clear understanding of that, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this geomagnetic pole can move all over the Earth as fast as it wants. It's not going to change the rotation of Earth. And I think in this radio show, if you've only listened to this one, you have a pretty good idea that the Arctic has been frozen and up in the Arctic for at least the last 2 million years.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the implications for the magnetic pole shifting so rapidly?
Well, certainly, I mean, this acceleration here indicates that we're heading towards a big change. That's what it suggests to me.
Yeah, and if the poles migrate away from the rotational pole towards the equator, the only time that happens as the field intensity weakens. And let me pull up. Oh, do I have it up here? The greatest paper of the decade. I implore everyone to read this paper. The Role of Geomagnetic Field Intensity in Late Quaternary Evolution of Humans and Mammals. And the data set, the proxy data they have is bar none. The geomagnetic field intensity on the right of this graph goes from present all the way back to 70,000 years ago. Okay, and the Pringle Falls is here, like 55,000. I was off by 100,000. So this big drop down here is the Pringle Falls. And then you come up here and then the 41,000, this is the Lechamp excursion. And you can see there are several smaller excursions happening here. One at 28, one at 22, and then an extended excursion during the Younger Dryas event, which goes from 12.9 to about 8,000 years ago. And then the field intensity recovers. And now you can see we're dropping back down into that next geomagnetic excursion. We're almost approaching Younger Dryas levels.
Yeah.
And what happens during these bottoms is there's extinction of fauna. So this graph alone rewrites evolution in the sense that Earth's magnetic field intensity is controlling it directly.
Yeah. Yeah. And for our listeners, I just wanted to point out that, when our magnetosphere is strong, we have high polarity on Earth. But when things start shifting around, you have areas of positive and negative that are mixing a lot, which makes the field strength of the Earth very low, which makes us very susceptible to any solar impacts and cosmic rays.
Yeah, and according to the work of Zharkova, it also may be, and no, it wasn't her paper, but I wish I pulled this up here. Here's solar proton events for the last 450 years. I do have it up here. This paper is fascinating because it goes over all the solar outbursts in recent history, just the last 450 years, and it compares them to the Carrington event. Now, and then it overlays it on solar cycles. So you can see you can't even see the Carrington event back there, but here are some major solar outbursts in recent time. And this is, that's not the Carrington event. Man, I wish I had looked through this paper because it's, I'm not going to get to what I need to show you. But what they determine is that these major outbursts occur at solar minimum, not at the bottom, but on the drive up or the drop down to the minimum. Just on the year before or the year after minimum is when solar flashes happen. So that's coming up too. That's coming up in 4 years to the next 7 years. That's the time when the solar flash may happen.
Yes.
Yeah. So what we have to look forward to is a major earthquake in the next 4 or 5 years, magnitude 8 or greater. Then shortly after that, a VEI 6 or 7 eruption. At the same time, we will have a solar outburst.
Sounds like fun.
And this is all corroborated in all the other catastrophes with the beryllium spikes, platinum spikes. And what we could be seeing here is a entourage effect where one guy only wants to, Graham Hancock talks about the comet, and Robert Schoch talks about the solar outburst, and Ben Davidson talks about the micronova. That's a closed-minded approach because now with all this peer-reviewed data, we now know that at grand minimas, this cocktail effect occurs. And the author of Dark Winter, my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone help me out here.
I've said this so many times, but no wonder human beings have these, I'm going to call them genetic memories of like fire and brimstone and just everything going to crap on Earth, because it happens.
Yeah, and the good news is that the crust probably won't slip. And the bad news is there won't be a flood either unless a large object hits an ocean. And then it will be a mega tsunami. And if you live on the coast, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not like you're getting to high ground.
Right.
All right, so let's sum it up. This is a pretty mind-blowing podcast. I didn't really set this up. I just thought if we had all these topics up, maybe we could come to some conclusions here. But it appears as if the next 15 years is going to be quite the geophysical ride.
Yeah. It's going to take quite a lot of people by surprise, for sure.
And it starts with the solar polar field reversal, which is coming up in a few years, 2 years maybe, for the max, solar max here of the cycle, in which case we'll have a large catastrophic earthquake somewhere. Now, most of the time it happens in areas that there aren't people, but we've had lots of major earthquakes in areas with little people recently. So the probability of a large earthquake happening where there are people is increasing. And the most likelihood of an area that could have a large earthquake that hasn't happened in a few hundred years is unfortunately Cascadia.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Now, that would give us an earthquake and a tsunami just in a few years, followed by a major volcanic eruption or eruptions of VEI 4, 5, 6, and maybe even 7.
That would be absolutely wild. I mean, if that happened, we would most definitely have a year without a summer, don't you think?
It would be way beyond that. It could be years without a summer if all these things layer up. And the earthquake's not going to change the climate. The tsunami's not going to change the climate. But if we have a couple VEI 6s and a VEI 7, that's going to be equivalent to the year without a summer, Tambora. And then, based on these papers, a few years later, we're going to have a major solar outburst.
Yeah.
Every time we've had super flares in the 6 times on Earth, which is the Miyake event, which is also known as the Charlemagne event, the event a few hundred years later in 900 AD. We have an event at 660 BC. We have an event at 2100 BC, and then the 7100 BC event. These are all hundreds of times bigger than the Carrington event. And after these events, we have dark ages, and the temperature drops precipitously. And it's not an eruption. The eruption's happening before that. So it's very interesting. The cascading effect of what happens on Earth is that we have major climate change. And this may be part of the climate change ruse, because we're about to have major climate change and they need to blame it on you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you and I have talked about this many times, that it's almost like by blaming it on humans, they're keeping the narrative going forward such that they can extract all of the wealth and power that remains from the humans that are still here, knowing that a lot of us are not going to make it.
Yeah, but what good if you and I are billionaires, right? And we're living in a mansion and we have a bunch of Lamborghinis and yachts. What good is our money or any of that materialistic crap after these events happen and the whole world has collapsed?
I mean, I have thought about that many times, because in that respect, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But then I remember that the globalist elite, they're all psychopaths. So maybe they really are just after the power for the time that they have left.
And they are probably knowledgeable enough and have at least a few scientific advisors that are telling them that we know that there are underground cities on Earth. Kuyu. We know there are dolmens. We know these people went under the ground. We know there were cavemen. And we have deep underground military bases where when it occurs and it gets bad enough, we just go underground for a few years and then we come back up and it's all ours.
And we also have billionaires who have been building their own underground bunkers. And there's a fair amount of that going on. Like, why are they doing that?
Well, Bezos alone not only has an underground bunker, but he has a launch pad to go off planet. So he's covered both. He can go
I don't know
down.
where he's going to go, but.
Well, if you just need to go up for a day or two and let the global tsunami hit, and then you land back down after the water recedes. Now, unfortunately, in the Bible, it took about 30 days, I think, for the water to recede.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to work out too well for him. But.
No, I don't think well, you can stay in orbit and then re-enter.
Yeah.
Wow, fascinating show. Thanks for joining us this week, babe.
No, you're welcome.
And we'll see you all next week on Revolution Radio, Freedom Slip, Studio B, noon, Saturdays, Mountain Time. #1 listener-supported radio. So give them a buck.
freedomslips.com.
We love you.
Right back after this message.
Hello, my name is